Thank you for coming back. We are now resuming our Deacon and Donuts, first one of 2015. And so, we covered mostly which I would call the basics of the Catholic faith. So now, I wanted to get into some other things. And so I thought, today why don't we do something interesting and talk about church architecture. Now, churches, as you know, come in various shapes and sizes, colors, depending on your location, what have you. And over the centuries, there have been certain styles that have developed, some becoming more popular than others. And so, what I thought I'd do is, for today, that we would kind of look at some of the more popular styles that have developed over the centuries. And kind of why the architects and builders chose these designs or what they were trying to convey in this type of structure. Now, I've kind of limited this to European architecture, so I'm not going to go into anything Greek or Byzantine or other Eastern designs. I don't know much about that myself, and I feel that would be a little bit too much to go through at one time. So we're going to kind of stick to Western European style of architecture, which in of itself is quite diverse. And so just to give you an example, if you look here on our front, on the first page here, you see two different buildings of two very different designs, but they are in fact the same place. Both of those are St. Columba's Cathedral in Youngstown. You have the one on the left, which was the old cathedral. That was built in, I think, 1902 or 1903. And of course, if you may know, that one burnt down due to a lightning strike in the 1950s. Caught the roof on fire, caved in. It was a very bad thing, I think. And so then you have the one on the right, which is our current building, done in a little more modern style. And so you can see, still the same corner, but you can see just the various difference of designs and colors and what the builders were trying to go for in building these buildings. Still St. Columba's Cathedral. Both of them are, but of course one is gone and one is current, so. And again, two different styles. So, with the beginning of church architecture, first of all, I do need to say this. If you build a structure and it's designed to be used as a church, it is in fact a church building. Now, sometimes you will get people say, this does not look like a church. Like it's some design you're not familiar with. They say, that doesn't even look like a church. Well, the fact is, if it's built as a church, it's a church building. That being said, that doesn't mean you have to like the design or like the style. It's still a church. Doesn't mean you have to like the style. In fact, as we go on, you will see that some architects and designers, they did things differently because they did not like the old style. They wanted to try something new, something different. And so you'll see that even during the centuries, which makes me say today, some things never change. There will always be critics as to, well, this style is better than that style, or this and that, or that's not how it ought to look, and this and that. But that's why we're doing this. That's why we're going to be looking at these various different styles. So, the very first type of Christian church that would have been used and popular would have been the house church. Now, this would have been during the times where Christianity was still an illegal religion. And so the Christians kind of had to hide. We've often heard stories of, especially in Rome, where the Christians would go into the catacombs to worship. Well, that was in Rome. In most other places, they didn't have those things. So what would often happen would be a wealthier member of the Christian community would basically have a house, and they would convert it strictly for church use. So on the outside, it looks just like an ordinary house that you would find in any typical Roman city. But inside, it was converted and used for different things. And so within this house church, you would have a place for teaching and instruction. You would have a place for baptism. And then, of course, you would have a place of worship, all in the house. Now, the earliest known house church that we've found, that has been found through archaeology, has been at a place called Dura, which was in the eastern part of the empire. The city had been abandoned for hundreds and hundreds of years, and when they were digging, they found this old house church that was there, which still contained, it was buried, but it still contained frescoes and paintings on the walls, which made them realize this was a Christian place of worship. Now, if you look at this diagram here, you'll see that in a typical house, I hope you can see that. There's my cursor there, so you can see here, here's the entrance here, little courtyard, which usually was open air. And then you have a baptistry here. This is where they would do all the baptisms. Here's the teaching area, and here, this area would be the actual worship space. There's the altar right here, there's the priest, here's everyone gathered. Now remember, in those days, unless you were a fully initiated, baptized Christian, you could not be a part of the Eucharistic worship. So they would have you in the teaching area or instruction elsewhere, but only fully initiated members could actually take part in the Eucharist. And so this guy here, you see him, so sometimes I think they would use a deacon for that. He was basically guarding the door, so if anyone who they weren't sure who they were, or maybe they were a spy sent by the state, he would basically deny them access. So putting that in today's perspective, imagine if myself, Deacon Chris, or Deacon Tom stayed at the entrance of the church before Mass, and if we didn't recognize you, we wouldn't let you in. Like, sorry, I don't know you. Of course, if I were at the door, I'd be turning a lot of people away, because I'm still pretty new here. So I'd say, I don't know who you are. I can't trust you. But in those days, this was a very serious thing. It was a serious precaution to try and attempt to keep this out of the eyes of the empire, because this was an illegal religion still, and at times persecuted. So basically, that's what the church was. It was just a converted house, but you still had all the areas, the altar. Now you notice here, this arrow pointing, that says it's pointing east, right here. In those days, all worship, everyone was facing east. That was by design. And in facing east, you were basically, the idea was you were facing the dawn. You were facing towards Jerusalem, towards the Holy Land. And so everyone, the priests, the people, they all faced east. Now later on in time, sometimes due to the terrain or location, you couldn't have everyone face east. But what they did was they kept it as what we would call liturgical east, or ad orientem in Latin, which is literally toward the east. And everyone would have faced that same direction. So St. Peter's in Rome, for example, due to its location and terrain, everyone was actually facing west, but it was still considered liturgically east, ad orientem style. So that's the reason for why they even show this arrow pointing east. So that would have been by design. Of course, eventually, Constantine the Great comes into power, and he allows a toleration of Christianity, doesn't have to be persecuted anymore, and now the Christians can move out and actually start building places of worship for the purpose of worship, and not just a converted house. And so what developed was the basilica style. Oh, first here, these are some of the frescoes they found in that old house church. This down here is Jesus and Peter walking on water. You can kind of see it down here. And then there's a boat. And then this here is the healing of the paralytic. You can see the person carrying their mat after being healed. And these and other frescoes were found in this house church. And would have just been painted right on the walls there. So now to the basilica style. Now, when the Christians wanted to build their own church, there was no style. There was nothing to go by. What does a Christian style look like? Well, no one knows. They didn't know at the time, because this is the first time they were actually building a church for their own. So, what they did not do was design their churches like the Roman temples. They did not follow their design. You see, the way the Roman temples worked was the actual sacrificing that they did was actually outside. And then the building itself would have housed basically the statue of whatever god or goddess was in there, and then just a few other things people could do there to congregate for, I guess, popular piety. Well, the church did not follow that design. Still at this point, you would have had to be an initiated Christian to take part in the Eucharistic liturgy. Therefore, you still would have needed to be inside the building. And so what would this look like? Well, there was a Roman building known as a basilica. And the basilicas served as places for public gatherings, for law courts and financial centers, halls, reception rooms, especially for imperial palaces. And so they would often be, like every Roman city would have like a basilica in there for these types of gatherings. And so think of it like a city hall or something. So it would be like a large open space, columns on either side to give support to the building. And then at the end there would be like a semicircle known as the asp. And then the apse, that's it. The apse. And it was like a semicircle projection. So there's like a long rectangular building, and then at the end, you'd have a place where like the emperor would sit at, where you would come meet with him. And so the early church used this design style in building their churches. So the long rectangular, a lot of columns, and then at the end, instead of a seat just for the guy in charge, that's where they would have the sanctuary, that's where they would have the altar and the bishop's chair as well. So they took that design in constructing these early basilicas. And so here's an example of the Trajan Basilica. This would have been a public building. So you see there is an open courtyard here, a lot of columns, and then here's showing the inside, a lot of big open spaces. And the people would have used this to worship. Now remember, there would have been no pews or chairs at the time. This would have been just an open space. Pews were kind of a late medieval invention. You would have just stood there the whole time for Mass and worship. And so they took this design, and that's how the early churches, especially the basilicas in Rome, would have been built. So this is a drawing of old St. Peter's in Rome. This was built and commissioned by Emperor Constantine, and this structure would have stood until the early 1500s when they built the current building. By that time, the structure was 1,200 years old and in bad disrepair. So they decided ultimately to simply rebuild the whole structure itself. But for 1,200 years, this is basically what you would have seen on that same spot. So you would have had the entrance here, you have the open courtyard, the atrium, then you would have walked in, this structure would have been the whole church building, and then at the very end here is where you would have had the sanctuary area. So this is like another little diagram, a little more colored drawing of it. And so, you have the atrium, the narthex, which is kind of like the vestibule area. And then like these long hallways. This area known as the bema, which is basically where the clergy would have sat. And then here at the back at the apse, the semicircle, there's the altar, and then the actual bishop's chair in the back. And so this would be the basic basilica design. Now, at this time, as they're building churches, what you often see is what you call the cruciform style, where the building itself is in the shape of a cross. And so this is a typical design which you would see, especially during the medieval era. So you would walk in through the portal, the door. There's usually maybe a tower somewhere. So you'd have these long main aisles, side aisles, transepts to fit in more people. And then again at the end you'd have, here's the altar, and then different little chapels here and there. And you would have had this basic cruciform form, in basically the shape of a cross. And part of that, and part of the reasoning behind that would be, one, it allowed for more room, but two, the idea that the building itself, you could say the building itself is a Christian building, that everything in there somehow has to do with Christ, with the faith, with something of the sort. So actually building in the style of a cross became very popular. Now, after the Western Empire fell, church building, church construction kind of hit a low point. And it was not until about the time of Charlemagne in the 9th century that you started seeing an upswing of building again. And so, wanting to borrow from the old Roman style, you got a design that became known as Romanesque. And so, what you see, they took the Roman style of using these arches, which as we know today have held up pretty well. And so they would use these for their Christian churches. And so it was fairly easy to engineer, and so they would use this design for their churches. So it began around the 9th century, but it really took off during the 11th century, where you see a lot of this style of church. Now, the arches that would define these churches, they were usually well modulated and geometrically logical, as they would say. It was proportional and made sense for a big weighty structure. Now, these buildings would have been generally pretty thick in order to hold up the structure. So you would usually have the lower level, and then you'd have an upper level of smaller arches to help kind of support the roof. And so these buildings were generally simplistic. They're not very ornate, geometrically simple. They have thick walls and they kind of have a blocky appearance. And so because the walls had to be so thick and strong, the windows could not be all that big. And as a result, you often would get it would kind of appear very dark inside. And so you had this stone, you don't get a lot of light coming through, so kind of have a darker inside appearance. So you can kind of see here in this church, you got the tall ceiling, but you got these arches here. See, the windows are, you got the front window here, big one, but usually you have some towers on the side. So again, you can see here on the left, you have like very basic arches supported by some columns, all properly spaced. As you can see, the windows are not very large, even on the outside of this building here. Again, very simplistic design, not a lot of ornamentation or decoration that you would see on the inside. So, a very basic structure. Again, you see here on the right, bigger arches here, smaller arches on the top, and then a very just basic ceiling design. Now, if you look here on the left, this was a typical door or portal design. And so, you have the columns, and then, again, a simple rounded arch here. And usually there was like two doors with another column in the middle. And so that was a very basic design, fairly easy to build, but you really couldn't do much with it as a result. However, over time, engineers began developing different techniques in building, which would allow them to do new things with it. And so from there, church architecture evolved into what we would call the Gothic style. So here's a picture of the cathedral at Reims. I can see it still kind of has the same basic design, but now there's a lot more going on, as you can see. You see these structures beginning to appear in the 12th century, and they were especially popular in France and Germany. And a greater focus is kind of put on style and aesthetics along with functionality. So you see a lot more decoration, you see a lot more ornamentation in these buildings. And there's several factors in a Gothic architecture. One, they were built to be tall. The designers wanted to see how tall they could go with this. And by design, as you approach the building, it makes you want to look up. In other words, putting your eyes and your focus up above, towards heaven. That was the idea of building tall. At the same time, an engineering technique was developed called the flying buttress. And these were basically outside supports that would support the wall. And in doing so, you could build the walls thinner, and because they were thinner, you could build higher and taller, and because of that, you could make your windows bigger, now that you have this extra support. What you also see is pointed arches. A pointed arch, as opposed to a rounded arch, is stronger. It can support more weight. So again, with this pointed arch, you could, again, build taller. So you see here a lot of these pointed arches everywhere. And again, because it's pointed, it focuses you up higher, focuses you to look taller, to look up more. Then you could also do vaulted ceilings, which came in various designs. So you didn't just have to have the same basic ceiling anymore, you could do a lot more with it. And these arches with the vaulted ceilings would give another impression of height and magnificence. Also, because the walls were thinner, you could build larger windows. So a lot of these Gothic cathedrals had large windows, a lot more open space, so it doesn't seem so cold and dark inside anymore. It allows for more light to come in, and it no longer appears as a darker, cramped space. And then then they have an increased decoration and ornate style. So you see this one, you see the large windows here. You see all these little statues on the inside, and on the outside for that matter. So you see a lot more ornateness and decoration to this building. This is the cathedral at Chartres in France. As you can see with this one, and these pictures do not do these churches justice. These are massive buildings that just dominate the entire landscape there around. So like with this cathedral, you can see the large open space here, a lot of big windows, it's a lot more open, a lot more light is coming through. You can see on the outside here all these buttresses against the wall which are holding the cathedral up. Again, you can see from the roof here, it's of the cruciform style, it's in the shape of a cross. Unlike, say, the Basilica Romanesque style, there was not as much thought given to proportion. So sometimes they would just build really tall, sometimes they would build very long. If you notice here, these two towers are not of equal design, they are not of equal height either. And there was reasoning for this. Now, I believe it is Chartres Cathedral in which it was built to be like a certain height. And I think they built it to be, let me think, I think like 144 feet tall, which is actually a biblical number, especially in the book of Revelation. So like everything in the design is biblical or had something to do with the faith. The design of the stained glass windows, of all the scenes they would depict on it. And again, the building of grandness and largeness that draws you up for this. The giant windows, the large towers. This is the cathedral at Cologne, Germany. This is a massive building. Again, the pictures do not do it justice of just how large this building is. So again, you see here the portals, the doors, like, see, there's a person there, and there's the rest of the building. Again, it draws you to look up towards the heavens. So again, you see the large windows, the pointed arches, the buttresses on the outside. And you can see here on the inside, again, the arches, the large windows that's allowing light to come into the building. Just an incredible, incredible size for these structures. And then this is Notre Dame in Paris. Again, large building, big towers, buttresses, and you can see some of the, Notre Dame is like some of the best stained glass, medieval stained glass windows, as you can see here. These windows here would be in the apse of the church. Like this right here is just one large window. And you can see the ornateness and the detail of the styles here. This is the door. This is the front end. This is the front entrance. So you can see at the bottom here, this is where the doors are. But then you can see all of these statues, all of these carvings, all these little angels everywhere. And kind of the idea behind that was, you were going to this door, you were leaving the world behind when you went into these churches. Everything that was outside, the day-to-day life of everything, the things that go in the world, you're leaving that behind. And so you were, literally the idea was, you are going into a small piece of heaven on earth. So that's why they went for this largeness, this grandness, away from the ordinary, everyday outside world into something otherworldly. So you had all these stages, the color of the light coming in through those windows, the grandness, the tallness of it. Literally going into another place, away from the world. And that was the basic idea behind these Gothic structures. And again, they were very popular. And so you see a lot of this being built at the time. And again, given the size and immensity of these structures, sometimes these would take well over 100 years to build, to fully complete them. Often like when they start building, the bishop who's there or the builders who are there, they know that they will not live to see these structures finished. But these ideas were to give glory to God, a fitting place of worship for the Christian faith, for all the people here on earth. And even though they knew they would not live to see the building finished, it didn't matter. They knew, let's get this building built. This sense of permanence as well. this magnificent structure built here on earth. But eventually there came a time when even the Gothic style fell out of favor. And you would get to the period known as the Renaissance. Now, it was the Renaissance architects and designers who created the term Gothic for the Gothic style. I mean, when the Gothic churches were being built, they were considered modern. This was the modern style. But at the Renaissance, that fell out of favor with them. And so they felt that design was barbarous, it was out of proportion, they were doing too much with it, it was getting away from the classical Roman and Greek style of buildings. And so they used the term Gothic as a pejorative term, as a way to say, these are awful designs. We don't like, these are terrible designs for churches. And so they gave the word Gothic. Because again, if you remember, the Goths were a group of barbarians from the north who helped take down the Roman Empire, helped cause it to collapse. So that's why they applied. See, these Gothic structures were never quite popular in Italy, which is where the Renaissance started. Again, remember, the Renaissance is a rediscovery of Greek and Roman culture, and so they wanted to go back to that style. And so they said, look at these structures, they're not like the old ways, they're too modern, if you will. We need to go back to an older style, a better style. And so they began doing that with their buildings. And so the Renaissance style places emphasis on symmetry and geometry and proper proportions and regularity of the components that would have been used in the ancient Greek and Roman times. What you also see is the use of domes in their construction. And you no longer get the large windows, so the windows get smaller again. But the walls are often adorned with a lot of paintings and artwork. So unlike the Romanesque style, which was often kind of bare inside, in the Renaissance style, you still have a lot of wall space, but they fill up that wall space with artwork and other paintings. You have an orderly arrangements of columns and lintels, and you have a use of semicircular arches, domes, and which replaces the more complex style and irregular profiles of the medieval buildings. So this building here that you see is the cathedral in Florence. And when the building was originally designed, it was designed as a kind of a more Gothic style. But again, these buildings take a long time to build. So as they were starting it, Gothic was kind of falling out of favor. And the Renaissance style was beginning to take shape. And so they added this large dome, as you can see. And I believe to this day it is still the largest brick and mortar dome in the world. St. Peter's dome is taller, I believe, but in terms of an actual circular space, this dome is actually a little bit larger. And as you can see, it's not a perfect circle shape, it's in an octagonal shape here. But it's a very large dome, which was kind of the style that they used. So, as you look out here, here's a typical Renaissance church here. Again, you're back to regular arches, the Roman style, you have the Roman style roof here, as you saw in the Basilica and Romanesque style. You see the pillars here, the open space, that's not as many decorations, not as many ornamentals, it's very proportioned well. As you can see on the outside, again, use of columns and typical arches. And so very much, in one sense, still kind of a grand style, but much more simplistic, much more proportional again. Basically, the Renaissance architect says, this is how a church ought to be like. And it was during this time, here's a few other designs again. You see, again, more Roman style artwork on the walls. Again, more use of columns. Still in the general cruciform style. So that style was always basically in use. But still a lot of artwork here. So not quite as tall as you would get with these Gothic cathedrals. But still they have their beauty in their own right. And it was at this time that St. Peter's was being rebuilt into a new church. And it would have been in this Renaissance style. So again, you see the facade here, St. Peter's, very much in the Roman style, which would have been normal for the Renaissance period. The large dome, of course, which would bring light in its own way in. But you see a lot more color here, paintings and such on the walls. Now, it is also at this point in time that a new style is now becoming into development. And it shows a little bit in St. Peter's Basilica here. And that is what you would call the Baroque style. So basically what happens is, the Renaissance style, you have these nice church buildings, they're very well proportioned, they look good, not too ornate, but still very nice looking. And then somewhere along the line, architects and designers began to say, okay, we've got this nice design. Now let's see if we can do something different with it. Let's go crazy a little bit, if you will. So they come up with the Baroque style. Baroque literally means a misshapen pearl. This period of architecture was called Baroque because some consider the style kind of odd or out of step with what was the norm. This style is kind of difficult to characterize because it can take a lot of different forms. Basically, Baroque has become synonymous with the extravagant, deformed, abnormal, unusual, absurd, irregular. And so, for example, instead of like nice walls, sharp walls at right angles, you see a lot of curved walls. This idea that the building is in motion, that somehow the building is moving. So you see a lot of more curves in the places. You see a lot of ornate decoration, especially that of statues. You see the designers using a lot of contrast between light and dark colors. So where there's a lot of clash between the colors, and that's done on purpose. And because the style just began becoming more and more ornate, basically saying, what can we do with this? What can we add? Let's try something different with it. And it was often used, if the Gothic style, that's built for the glory of God, to show the magnificence of the Christian faith. You have the Renaissance, which kind of shows the magnificence of good order, like the ancient Roman time, while still giving glory to God. Then you have the Baroque, and it's just saying, just look how cool we can be. Look at all these different styles we can try. And it was often kind of a show of power and pride. So we have to remember at this time, the Protestant Reformation is still fairly new. And whereas the Protestants in their churches would kind of go for a more simplistic design as they built their structures, basically in the Catholic areas of Europe, they said, well, let's go the opposite direction. Let's go all out. We're not afraid of statues. We're not afraid of artwork. Let's just put more and more and more of that in. So if you look at if you're looking at this picture here, you can see here you have, instead of a circular shape, you kind of have like an oval shape here. You still got the columns and everything, but they're of a curved design. If you look at the outside of this church here, you've got the domes and all that, but you see these little circular things or spirals there or something. Just a pure design choice. I don't even know what they do. They don't look like they hold up the structure. Maybe they do, but it's See, again, you see a lot of curves in there, a lot of statues everywhere. Here's something that really shows color contrast. So you have a lot of this white and bright colors here, and then suddenly all these dark colors here. And this would have been done on purpose, to create this clash of color. So you have this clash of color, again, a lot of, on the columns here you see a lot of statues, a lot of decoration and ornamental style. So you have a lot going on here, which is nothing compared to the next picture I'm about to show you. There's a whole lot going on in this picture. You've got statues of angels just randomly on the pillars here, statues everywhere, a lot of color clash here. There's paintings on the walls in different colors, a lot of light and then dark spaces everywhere, statues everywhere. Everything is highly decorated, highly ornamental. There is a lot going on here. Now, you can make it work. Some of these Baroque cathedrals and churches, you can make it work. But the idea here was, just show, look how grand we can be, look how different we can do things with it. So, again, a whole lot going on here. Very ornate, very decorative. Now, those were some of the basic designs and styles that developed. Now, what I've been showing you thus far was basically the big churches, the cathedrals. And the typical parish church, if you will, like in a small town, would not have been that magnificent, would not have been to that size. Maybe of a similar style, but certainly not to this grandness and largeness. What I've been showing you is basically like, the big churches, the famous ones that you can see and tour to this day. And so these styles would be used. These are basically the main styles. Which then brings us to what we would call the modern style. Now, here's the thing to remember. When all of these churches were being built, it was the modern style. The Basilica was being built as a modern style. The Romanesque church was being built as the modern style. The Gothic church was the modern style. Then the Renaissance church was the modern style. Then the Baroque church became the modern style. So how do you define today's current modern style? You really can't. At least, it's tough to characterize. How do you define modern style? Again, the names of these styles were often given after their era had passed. As a way of looking back and saying, well, looking at all this together, how do you define this? So I'm sure in later years, in later centuries, people will look back on today and perhaps have a definition on how would you define modern style churches. I don't know how they'll do it, but I'm sure they'll come up with something down the line. Now, part of the difference what you see designed today is, again, because of our modern technology and building techniques and materials that are used, you can do things you never could before. Think back to the Gothic design. Part of the reason they were able to build it, they were never able to do that before. But once they got better engineering techniques, they were able to try new things. So those pointed arches, those very tall structures, those very large windows. They began to do that partly because now they could. And so what you see with modern design, it's almost like you see, well, we have all this new technology, let's see what we can do with it. Let's try things out. Let's see what we can do. And so, with this new technology, you can try different things. And of course, you don't just apply that to regular buildings, but of course, people will apply that to their churches as well. And so, what you will see is, what you also see with churches is, especially today, is for the longest time you had that cruciform style of church. Now what you'll see a lot today is more of what they call either a semicircle, a fan-shaped church, or like a church in the round, they call it. So like this church here on the right, I don't have an interior shot, but it's a church in the round, so that the sanctuary is in the middle. Our parish here is a fan-shaped or semicircle church, which began becoming popular up into like after the 60s, and so the 1970s and 80s and 90s, that style is becoming popular. And so what you see with a lot of these churches is a little more simplistic in terms of decoration and adornment. So you really don't see this Baroque style where let's just keep throwing statues and colors and artwork at it just to see what we can do with it. What you see a lot more is kind of experimenting with the shapes of the buildings, trying out different things. And what you also see in this modern times is, again, there's no set style for everything. So, looking at other churches, so again, you see a more simplistic design usually in these churches. And this is kind of more of a fan shape here. So like this church here, again, a little bit of a blocky design. Some windows here, so you can't quite call it like, well, it's not quite Romanesque. I mean, it's still got the front, it's still got the tower there, but it's still what you would call a modern design. Again, how do you define modern design? I don't know yet. Someone might know, but I'm not a student of art and architecture, so this is merely my own speculation on the matter. But what you also see in modern times is that you can pretty much build anywhere. While certain styles have gone out of vogue or out of style, if you will, there's nothing to say you can't use any of these styles that we just looked at. So for example, the church on your left here is Our Lady of the Angels in Los Angeles. That's the cathedral there in Los Angeles. The church on your right is a church in country of Poland. And both of these churches were built about the same time, just about 10, 15 years ago. Two very different styles. One has a more classic Renaissance, this kind of reminds me of a Renaissance style, given the columns and the dome there. Cruciform shape. And this is more of a modern design, where a more blocky design. It's got, if I remember correctly about Our Lady of the Angels, there are actually no right angles in that building. I'd have to look that up again, but it's not what you would call a regular design. But again, these two churches were built about the same time. So even what you would call modern style doesn't mean you have to build it in that modern style. The thing today, because we're capable of it, we can really build it in any style we want for a church design. So again, even churches that are built today can be of an older design. They can build it Romanesque, they can build it Gothic, they can build it Baroque, they can build it Renaissance style, they can build it modern style, any style they want really. Cruciform shaped, fan shaped, you name it, they can build it that way. And what I wanted to show you was this one church in Barcelona called Sagrada Familia. This is a church that it may still be under construction. It's been being built for over 100 years. And this has a unique design. In one sense, it kind of reminds you of a Gothic church, given the windows, the pointed arches, but at the same time, there's something different about it. How to define it, I don't know. But you can see like the type of stone that's being used, these towers here. You can see a close-up. You have a very ornate design around the windows. A lot of decoration, but at the same time, you have some statues here adorning the outside of this large church. And on the inside, you have these pillars, like you would in a typical church, but as you can see, they're designed to resemble trees. They're designed to resemble tree trunks, and then this is supposed to, and this is meant to resemble like you're in a forest. Again, and this was designed back in like the early 1900s. Like this was designed either the early 1900s or late 1800s. I forget. And this church has been under construction for about 100 years. So as you can see, the design of it is very different. It's, in one sense, it has that old Gothic style, but in another sense, it has a very modern twist on it. So looking back, again, you have all these different designs, all these different structures. Some of it built based on what can we do with this. Some of it's limited by technology. Some have a more purpose design to either inspire or to impress. But the one thing they all have in common, every single one of them, is that they were designed for use for worship. Designed for the use for the sacraments. Designed for the worship of God. Designed for the Eucharist. Designed for the Christian community to come together as members of one faith to worship and to praise God. They all have that in common, and therefore they are all churches. But like I said at the beginning, doesn't mean you have to like the style. As you remember, the Renaissance people did not like Gothic design at all, which is why they strayed away from it. In every age, in every location, everyone's going to have their different tastes. The important thing is that these churches, these buildings, are about the worship and praise of God. That is one thing they must all have. Some have a modern twist, some have a classic design, but that is the purpose here. Again, I've only hit some of these designs, some of these styles. I haven't even touched upon the Eastern and Byzantine styles, nor have I touched upon the Greek or the Orthodox styles of churches. But if you ever have time to look these up, I found most of these pictures, again, just by going online and searching for them. And of course, if you ever have the chance, see these buildings in person, because these pictures will never do it justice. And so, with that said, are there any questions, comments, things I maybe didn't talk about, clarifications on any church design or architecture or function of a church building? Yes?
Did the most stained glass windows then start during the Gothic design?
Let's see, did most of the idea of stained glass windows, did that start during the Gothic design? I'm not particularly sure about that. It was obvious, it was most certainly made popular during the Gothic era. I mean, part of the idea of the windows before was to just let light into the building itself. So like for example, like in the old basilica style, you know, the roofs would have been made with wood and all that. And so you would have had the stone columns and all that, and part of the upper windows were designed to let light in. As you got to the Romanesque period, you had a lot more stone structure. And so, because of their weight, you had to build them a certain thickness, and you could only build them so tall. The windows could, again, only be so large. And so part of the idea with stained glass was to actually, not only to have nice pictures for people to look at. Remember, stained glass itself was used as a teaching tool. Because most people were illiterate, he would have scenes from Scripture, scenes of saints, and so stained glass was used as a teaching method as well. And so in the Gothic period, you have these larger windows, a lot more colorful, And part of that would bring colored light into the building itself. So you're not just getting the regular pure light in, but you're getting a lot of colored light to come into the building. So the Gothic period definitely was the popular time for stained glass windows. Other questions and comments? Yes?
I think what strikes me is the expense. And I know, looking at the Renaissance, as I recall it, there seemed to be a lot of building Renaissance cathedrals, basilicas, about the same time, whether it's competition from various bishops and so forth, which lent itself more stridently towards indulgences. To pay for it, which creates the impression that you have to pay to play to get to heaven and so forth. That's one thought. The second thought, just a commentary, is that one can hardly understand how much it would cost to build a similar Renaissance cathedral today with today's dollars.
Yes, now make no mistake. These buildings in any age were expensive, were time consuming. But you are right about one sense. These buildings, especially the large ones, was a source of local pride, town pride, if you will. And especially during the Renaissance era, you would kind of have competition. So like, you have to remember, like in the Renaissance era, Italy was not a unified country. So, you know, Florence was kind of its own city-state, along with Venice, and there's the Papal States with Rome, Sicily, and all those other places. And so, yeah, they did kind of compete with one another. Who could build better? Who could build grander? And yes, they were expensive. It is well known that St. Peter's Basilica, a good amount of it was paid for through indulgences to help pay for that structure. And you must remember, especially in the Renaissance period, the church was a great patron of the arts. And so they would hire all these famous artists and sculptors of the day to paint these scenes. So that's when you have Michelangelo and Da Vinci and Raphael and all the other great Renaissance artists of those days. In fact, it was Michelangelo who helped design St. Peter's Basilica. Like its same basic design as well as its dome as well. I mean, that was part of his design. And so you have all these structures being built. Now in the Middle Ages, when the Gothic structures were being built, yes, there was kind of local pride there, but that was, I would characterize the Gothic period as, I would say, more about, you know, showing forth the grandness of the Christian faith. You know, this is the Middle Ages at the height of Christendom. And so, you know, really showing the glory of God, you know, so building to tall heights, again, to raise your spirits and your eyes up to heaven. Have these stained glass windows to show off the faith. You get this ideas of grandness and that you're leaving the world, when you enter our church, you're leaving the world behind and entering into the realm of God. Truly a house of God in these Gothic structures. And then, of course, with the Baroque period, again, you know, that was more characterized by, look how grand we can be. Still taking the same Renaissance design, but, you know, let's add more things here. Let's try this with the design. Let's try a little more of these curves here. Let's try and work with the colors a little bit, see what we can do with that. So yes, you know, so like you said, you know, again, very expensive, always expensive. But again, because it was kind of a source of personal pride for the people, they were willing, rich and poor alike, to donate in order to get these structures built. So like everyone was involved with it.
And also my understanding that a lot of the Gothic churches were funded by pilgrims.
Yes, people would visit a pilgrimage site, and then they would leave a donation there in order to help pay for the church. I mean, there have been cases where Like, for example, at the cathedral at Pisa, you know, most people know it for its leaning tower, but it's a whole complex there, the cathedral, the baptistry, and the tower itself. And that construction lasted hundreds of years. At some point it had to stop because they ran out of funds. Then they had to restart and build it again. And again, some of these structures took hundreds of years, again, partly because they ran out of money. And so they had to stop construction. Eventually they'd raise enough money, they would start up again. And so that was part of it as well. And just to get these things going. So yeah, money is in fact a factor in what you can do with it. Other questions or clarifications? Well, if there is no more, then thank you very much for coming back for this year. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly had a lot of fun researching this and finding all these, which I wish I could show you some other things. And I found a lot of really great pictures, great designs. Of course, I can only put so much into this. So, again, if you can, get to these places, see the buildings for yourself. Because it is really quite something. I myself have never been to Europe. I hope to get there eventually. So all these buildings shown, I've not seen any of them with my own eyes. I hope to get to them one day. But again, it's really neat just to kind of research these buildings. And again, look into the other styles that I did not show you. And with that said, we will not be meeting next week. Next week, I have another commitment going on, so we will not have Deacon and Donuts next week, but we will resume on the 25th. So thank you very much.